The silence in the Situation Room is absolute, broken only by the low hum of climate control. Outside, a constitutional democracy holds its breath. The date is January 21st. The inauguration of a newly elected president has concluded. The speeches are finished, yet a single, unprecedented question hangs over the republic. What happens when a defeated incumbent, invoking a whirlwind of legal challenges and mass protests, simply refuses to vacate the office? This is no longer a theoretical debate in law school seminars. For the first time in American history, it is a concrete scenario being wargamed by Pentagon officials, whispered about in federal agencies, and driving a multi-billion-dollar security preparation industry. At the heart of this chilling contingency is one man, Donald J. Trump. His rhetoric, his past actions, and his unambiguous statements about seeking retribution and upending norms have convinced a broad swath of legal scholars, national security veterans, and political operatives that the unthinkable must be planned for. The foundational American tradition of peaceful transfer of power, a ritual observed since 1801, now faces its most severe stress test. We are entering an era where the guardrails of democracy are no longer made of unbreakable steel, but are being tested for their tensile strength under extreme political force. To understand how we arrived at this precipice, one must revisit the violent rupture of January 6, 2021. That day was not an endpoint, but a prologue. The failed insurrection demonstrated both a willingness to disrupt the constitutional process and, crucially, a catastrophic failure of coordination among federal and state entities to secure it. In its aftermath, instead of a national reckoning that solidified norms, the political landscape fractured further. The core narrative of a stolen election was not discarded by the defeated president or his party, but meticulously maintained and embedded into the platform of a movement. The legal architecture for resolving a disputed presidential election is a patchwork of 19th-century laws and 20th-century amendments, never stress-tested under modern conditions of hyperpolarization and disinformation. The Electoral Count Act of 1887, long criticized by scholars as a ticking time bomb of ambiguous language, was revised in 2022 to make Congress's certification role more ministerial. But legal experts warn these reforms may only address the last mile of the process. They do not solve for chaos at the starting gate in the states where electoral votes are originated. Historically, the losing candidate's concession, while not legally required, has been the grease that allows the immense machinery of transition to begin turning. It unlocks millions in federal funds for the incoming team, mandates security clearances, and initiates the president-elect's access to the presidential daily brief. Without it, the entire process seizes up. The General Services Administration's hesitant ascertainment of Joe Biden's victory weeks after the 2020 election offered a preview of how bureaucratic inertia can be weaponized to create dangerous delays in the transfer of critical national security information. The role of state-level officials has become a new frontline. In 2020, a handful of Republican state election officials and canvassers in Georgia, Michigan, and Arizona resisted intense pressure to find votes or subvert their own certified results. Their courage was hailed as democratic salvation. Today, in many of those same pivotal states, the laws have been changed, and those officials have been replaced by actors who have explicitly stated they would not have certified the 2020 outcome. The firewall, in essence, has been deliberately remodeled. Simultaneously, the judicial branch's role as final arbiter has been systematically undermined. The relentless portrayal of the courts as politically corrupt or weaponized by the deep state has eroded public faith in their judgments. A strategy of flooding the zone with litigation, regardless of merit, serves not to win in court, but to delegitimize the process in the court of public opinion and create a pretext for extra-constitutional action. The goal is to create enough smoke to declare the entire house on fire. Internationally, America's adversaries have taken exhaustive notes. The scenes of chaos on Capitol Hill were broadcast globally, serving as a potent recruitment tool for autocrats who argue that Western democracy is feeble and corrupt. For nations like Russia and China, a second, and this time potentially successful, disruption of the American transfer of power would represent a geopolitical windfall, validating their models of governance and paralyzing U.S. foreign policy at a moment of profound global instability. Furthermore, the domestic security apparatus is caught in a paradox. Its planning for civil unrest and the protection of federal personnel is now scrutinized through a lens of partisan suspicion. Any large-scale deployment of National Guard or Department of Homeland Security assets in a capital city awaiting inauguration could be framed by one side as a necessary precaution and by the other as the militarization of politics, a prelude to martial law. This paralyzes proactive planning. We now move to the present day, a landscape simmering with preparatory conflict. The campaign rhetoric for the upcoming election cycle has already moved beyond policy disputes into the territory of institutional capture. Promises to purge the civil service of disloyal elements, to deploy the military domestically, and to weaponize the Department of Justice against political opponents are no longer whispered implications but stated goals. This creates a permissive atmosphere for the ultimate refusal. Behind closed doors, sources within the Department of Defense and the Justice Department confirm that continuity of government exercises now include scenarios where lawful orders are ambiguous. What is the protocol if the sitting president, as commander-in-chief, orders a military unit to secure a federal building against what he claims are illegitimate authorities? The chain of command faces a crisis of conscience potentially without precedent in American history. The oath is to the Constitution, not the person, but in the fog of a constitutional crisis, discerning that line becomes a personal and professional nightmare for every officer. The political tension is fractal, repeating at every level of governance. In several state legislatures, draft legislation circulates that would allow them to directly appoint electors, irrespective of the popular vote, in the case of a failed election. This legalistic phrase is a loophole large enough to drive a tank through, allowing a state legislature to declare any outcome they disagree with as failed due to unsupported allegations of fraud. It effectively provides a roadmap for state-level coups. Media ecosystems have calcified into mutually exclusive realities. In one, any election loss is de facto evidence of systemic cheating. In the other, the very discussion of contingency planning is seen as alarmist or an attempt to sway the election. This information bifurcation ensures that no common set of facts exists from which to negotiate a resolution. Each side would be operating from a completely different understanding of basic reality, making de-escalation almost impossible. The economic implications are already shuddering through markets. Institutional investors are conducting political risk assessments on U.S. Treasury bonds that were once considered the global risk-free benchmark. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency rests not just on economic might but on political stability. A protracted crisis that calls into question who legitimately controls the nuclear arsenal and the financial levers of government would trigger capital flight and a market seizure of historic proportions. On the ground, activist networks on both the far right and left are preparing for conflict. Federal law enforcement assessments, seen by our reporters, describe a proliferation of armed groups training for what they believe is an inevitable confrontation. The tinder is dry, spread across every state, awaiting a single spark from a contested election result. The social contract that allows people to accept electoral loss is fraying, replaced by a zero-sum view of politics as existential war. We now turn to expert analysis to gauge the potential consequences. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a constitutional historian at Yale, frames the stakes starkly. We have focused for centuries on the how of transferring power, the ceremonies, the oaths. We assumed the will to do so was immutable. We are now discovering that norm is the most fragile part of the entire system. Once a critical mass of officials and citizens no longer believes in the legitimacy of the process itself, the written words of the Constitution become a script for a play where the actors have refused their parts. A former senior CIA operative, who spoke on condition of anonymity due to ongoing work, outlined the national security freefall. Day 1 without a clear transition. The intelligence briefings stop for the incoming team. Day 3. Allied intelligence services begin to withhold the most sensitive material. Unsure who is in charge. Day 7. Adversaries begin probing actions in cyberspace and along diplomatic fault lines to test for weakness or distraction. Within a month, the United States becomes a black box to itself and the world, its decision-making paralyzed. Legal scholars point to the alarming gaps. Professor Alan Chen of the University of Chicago Law School explains, The 20th Amendment states the president's term ends at noon on January 20th. Full stop. But it does not specify the mechanism for physical removal if they resist. It presumes rationality. The enforcement would likely fall to the Marshal of the Supreme Court, a figure with no practical police force, or hinge on the Attorney General ordering the FBI to remove the president. The sheer physical absurdity of that image underscores how utterly our system relies on voluntary compliance. Insiders within the federal bureaucracy describe a climate of fear and preemptive resignation. You have mid-level directors at agencies like EPA, FDA, and Interior, who are political appointees, says one former Office of Personnel Management director. If they believe their boss will not leave and may order them to take illegal actions to cement his hold, their only recourse may be to resign in protest en masse. This would cause the operational collapse of day-to-day governance. Everything from food inspection to air traffic control could face disruption. The global impact extends beyond geopolitics into the realm of ideology. For decades, the US has funded democracy initiatives abroad, insisting on transparent elections and peaceful transitions, says Maria Fernandez, a former ambassador to the United Nations. That moral authority evaporates instantly. Authoritarians from Venezuela to Hungary will cite the American chaos to justify their own crackdowns. The global democratic recession would become a full-blown depression, with the architect being its oldest exemplar. Economic analysts model scenarios ranging from bad to catastrophic. A swift resolution might see a sharp but temporary market correction. A protracted crisis lasting weeks could freeze the commercial paper market, crash the dollar, and trigger a global recession as supply chains that rely on US stability snap. The Federal Reserve would be operating in a political vacuum, its actions viewed as inherently political, further damaging its credibility. The societal consequences are perhaps the most dire. Trust in institutions already low would be shattered for a generation. You would see a rapid balkanization within the country, predicts sociologist Dr. Robert Hill. States controlled by different parties would begin to assert sovereignty, ignoring federal directives they deem illegitimate. Law enforcement cooperation across state lines would break down. It's not a prediction of civil war, but it is a prediction of the United States becoming ungovernable as a unified entity. The role of the military leadership becomes paramount in such a scenario. Retired General Mark Sorensen, former head of U.S. Northern Command, states bluntly, "The moment the president uses his authority as commander-in-chief to order units to act in a domestic political dispute, the military is in territory forbidden by posse comitatus and its own ethos. The Joint Chiefs would be forced to make a collective decision to either obey or effectively stage a soft coup to protect the constitutional order. There is no clean, apolitical path for them." Looking to future scenarios, the range of possibilities is narrow, and all are perilous. In a best-case but still disruptive scenario, the refusal is largely rhetorical and performative. The incumbent stages a parallel rally, but ultimately leaves the White House on January 20th, continuing to claim illegitimacy from the sidelines. This still does profound, lasting damage to the institution of the presidency and establishes a dangerous new norm for all future losers. A mid-level crisis scenario involves the incumbent physically remaining in the White House or Mar-a-Lago, while the duly inaugurated president operates from a separate location, perhaps the Pentagon or an emergency facility. Two sets of acting officials claim authority over executive agencies. Lower-level bureaucrats must choose whom to obey. Red and blue states align behind rival presidents. The country endures a weeks-long paralysis until financial market collapse and total governmental breakdown force a resolution, likely through a brokered extra-constitutional political deal that further erodes the rule of law. The worst-case scenario involves widespread violence, armed factions mobilized to support each claimant, isolated clashes between federal law enforcement and protesters, or between rival groups of protesters escalate. State governors deploy their National Guards in opposition to federal directives. The chain of command of the U.S. military splinters along political lines among the officer corps. This is the path to a second civil war, not fought over geography, but over the very concept of legitimate authority. The risks extend to the electoral process itself. Knowing that the aftermath could be catastrophic, there is a heightened chance that one side or both may seek to preempt the uncertainty through more aggressive pre-election tactics. This could include intensified voter intimidation, localized suppression so severe it alters state outcomes, or even acts of terrorism aimed at disrupting the voting process in key precincts. The crisis, therefore, may not begin on election day, but be triggered long before the first vote is counted. International actors will not be idle spectators. Analysts at the Rand Corporation suggest that rivals like Russia would likely engage in massive cyber operations to deepen the confusion, perhaps creating fake emergencies or fabricating evidence of atrocities to inflame partisan divisions. Meanwhile, allies would be forced to make a binary choice: which American administration to recognize. The NATO alliance could fracture overnight depending on whether Europe backs the constitutional successor or the sitting president. The long-term damage to the American project is incalculable. Even if the immediate crisis is resolved, the precedent is set. Every close election thereafter would carry the threat of a loser's veto. The presidency would be seen not as a temporary stewardship, but as a prize to be held by any means necessary. The foundational idea of a government of laws, not men, would lie in ruins, replaced by a system where raw power and the loyalty of armed forces determine control. In the final analysis, this is not a story about one man. It is a story about the vulnerabilities inherent in a system that always relied more on shared goodwill than on enforced codicils. The machinery of American democracy, for all its checks and balances, lacks a fail-safe against bad faith actors who occupy its highest offices and are willing to break its core traditions. The crisis, if it comes, will reveal that the most important pillar of the Republic was never written down. It was the collective agreement to abide by the result. As the sun sets on a capital city awaiting its fate, the question is no longer merely what if, but how do we prevent it? The answer lies not in the halls of power in Washington, but in the willingness of citizens, officials, soldiers, and judges to place their oath to a document and an idea above loyalty to a person or party. The coming test is not of the Constitution's text, but of the national character. The world watches, knowing that if the light of the oldest democracy falters, the global descent into a darker, more authoritarian age will accelerate. The silence in the Situation Room is a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. It will be filled, one way or another,